Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting, but get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Now there was a disciple in Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, "Ananias." He answered, "Here I am, Lord." The Lord said to him, "Get up and go to the street called Straight, and at the house of Judas look for a man of Tarsus named Saul. At this moment he is praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight." But Ananias answered, "Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who invoke your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is an instrument whom I have chosen to bring my name before Gentiles and kings and before the people of Israel. I myself will show him how much he has to suffer for the sake of my name." So Ananias went and entered the house. He laid his hands on Saul and said, "Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and his sight was restored. Then he got up and was baptized, and after taking some food, he regained his strength. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right, children, join me at the back table. I think about my biggest stumbles in life, the things that I regret most, and oftentimes they have to do with how I've treated other people, my relationships with other people. A lot of times they have to do with how I have determined what somebody is like based on a few pieces of information. I've decided what they are, who they are, based on just a little bit of input. It might be the definition of prejudice, but sometimes we use that word to think of like ethnicity or skin color or something, where we see somebody far off and automatically think we know something about them. It's usually a little bit deeper than that, in the sense that I at least give them a chance to open their mouths, and then they've proven to me that they are foolish. So I let people say the things they say, and I think about what the topics are they always seem to be hung up on, and occasionally am influenced by how they dress. And all of these things start to add up for me, and I realize that that's not quite the standard by which God might assess who we are. That somebody, that all of us are more complex than what we have on in our subject-verb agreement and the political topics that we always seem to have to deal with. And our past. We're a little more complex than just what our past has been. On my best days, I get this. I have a friend who's a self-described nerd. He talks of himself in those terms. And you'd agree with him. He looks the part, he acts the part, he thinks the part, he talks the part. My friend is also tall. And I think about how we don't determine how we're going to be in a relationship with him due to the fact that he's tall. But we determine his nerdishness somehow affects our relationship with him. Both of those are attributes, right? Nerd is a characteristic, tall is a characteristic. If we say he's tall, I can still deal with that. He's nerdish, I don't know. It's interesting to me that we don't say he's a child of God, who happens to be nerdish and happens to be tall. and let that be our starting place. On my best days, I get that, but I have plenty of bad days. I have a friend who drones on and on about health care. And I want to tell him that if he keeps going, one of us is going to need a little extra coverage. It just gets so, I got your point. Let's move on. But before we were friends, when he would talk that way, I would think, that's all there is to him. And I would try to project then every political view he must hold because he holds this particular view about healthcare. I would let that determine how I thought he must think on every other topic, and it would become a wall between us. I couldn't imagine, because he was so assertive and so certain, that he might have some frailties in his life too, that he might be humble on some things, that he might be loving on some things, generous on some things. It took a long time of getting to know him before I realized that piece of his deal wasn't the whole of who he was. Can you imagine the Israelites' surprise when Pharaoh's adopted son became the one who said, I'll lead you out of here? He had been royalty. Moses had lived in the palace. He had been the one who oversaw these Israelite slaves doing the work of his adopted father. He'd been surrounded by people who talked about those people and what was wrong with them. And surely he had said some of those same things growing up. That would have been the spirit that he grew up in. Even more certainly, those people, the Israelites, would have looked at Moses and talked about what he must be like. Guilty by association. Guilty by assumption. Even guilty by action. Moses was a strong person. A hot-headed, justice-oriented type person. When he saw an Egyptian beat an Israeli slave, Moses went and killed the Egyptian. And the other slaves said to Moses, wait, are you going to kill us? They then thought they knew who Moses was, guilty by action. Jesus dealt with these same kinds of things. He was presumed guilty by the people he spent time with. He ate with sinners. Surely then he's one of them. He spent time with tax collectors and prostitutes. He must not know who these people are, and if he does, then he must be like them, birds of a feather flock together. Some of those birds were tax collectors, some were prostitutes, and Jesus seemed to embrace them all. A sinful woman washed his feet with her hair, weeping as she did. And the Pharisees said, well, he's clearly not a prophet, because if he was a prophet, then he would know who it is that's doing this kind of thing, and he would refuse her act. He gave the benefit of the doubt. He must not be a prophet, because he wouldn't let this thing go on. Jesus knew exactly who she was. He knew what kind of person she was. He knew she was one of his people, a child of his. He let her wash his feet. The tax collector hung his head and confessed his sin, while the Pharisee looked over and thanked God that he was not one of those people. At least he wasn't like him. And Jesus says the tax collector, who was humble and repentant, went home a righteous man, and the Pharisee was no more forgiven than when he walked into that place to pray. These are Jesus' people, the ones he knows about. We think we know people. And then Jesus uses a story like that to help us know we don't even really know ourselves. We aren't even able to assess ourselves clearly when we go before God and point out the faults in another and don't see the faults in our own lives. The Pharisee was right. The tax collector was sinful. If you look solely on the level of occupation, he was one of the hated people in their midst. He was on the side of Caesar. He worked for the oppressor. He came and took money they barely had to survive on and took a little more for himself. He lived well while they barely were able to live. The Pharisee was right. At least I'm not like him, he prayed before God. It's easy to hate persons like that. If you judge a book by its cover, then tax collectors and prostitutes are pretty despicable cover. What happens is we take the cover and think we know the whole book, right? That's the point of the metaphor, that we can simply look at the cover and determine we know what's all in there. The Pharisee was sure he knew all about the tax collector because he knew what his job was. Turns out that the tax collector was a sinful man and a child of God. It turns out that the prostitute was a sinful woman and a child of God. It turns out that Moses was a man who murdered and a child of God. It turns out that my healthcare battering friend is tough on that topic. He's a child of God. It turns out that my nerdish tall friend is nothing more than a child of God. Too often we take a piece or two of information and we let that determine then the whole of what we believe. Rather than use the one single piece of information that Jesus used as his starting place. Whatever else it is that is about this person, at their core, because I made them so, they are a child of mine. That doesn't mean that Jesus dismisses sinfulness. He commands us to not sin. He calls us out of sin. He, at an eternally high price, forgave sin. But sin is not the primary identifying factor that he uses to look at any one of us. Last Sunday's reading from Acts ended ominously. We talked about Stephen being martyred. And they talked as the stones were being thrown, as Stephen was being killed, that Saul looked on these things and he approved. And today begins the new story about Saul. And once again, Acts opens up with, in his murderous activity, Saul continues to threaten, to persecute, to seek out those who are following Christ. And he's on his way to Damascus to do the very same thing. He's on his way. He's going towards these Christians, these people like Ananias, to bring them back to Jerusalem, to make them stand trial for their heresy, for their charges against God. Paul was good at it. Saul was good at it. He was real good at it. He had a reputation. You didn't have to meet him to know you didn't like him. People would talk quite clearly about what this man was up to and how you wanted to avoid him. So when Ananias was told that Saul was in their town, was blind, and that Ananias was to go and to heal him, he protested quickly, "Lord, I know about this man. I know what he's been up to. Plenty of people have told me all I need to know about Saul. Don't make me go." When Jonah was sent to Nineveh, do you remember what it was why he wanted to avoid that calling? He knew those people, right? They were evil. They were beyond redemption. Let's not waste our time on them. But he had one more protest, one that